Hello, everybody. I'm Helena Cobban. I'm honored to be the president of Just World Educational, a small nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., in the traditional lands of the Piscataways. Although honestly, I'm currently right now in New York City. Today is June 18th, 2022. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. Our guest today on this series on the urgency of banning nuclear weapons is Joseph Gerson, who's the executive director of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and vice president of the International Peace Bureau. Gerson is a veteran anti-nuclear organizer who has just been at meetings in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, on the international coordination of nuclear weapons-free zones. And he is with us today from Vienna, where he is attending many of the meetings of the Nuclear Ban Week being organized there by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, in connection with the first ever meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm so glad you can be with us, Joseph.
It's my pleasure.
This is the fifth public conversation we've held in this series. You can see the records of the previous four if you follow the link that is prominently on the homepage of our website, www.justworldeducational.org, actually, or if you follow this link. If you follow the link, you can also learn more about the upcoming sessions in this series, which will include another great conversation with someone who's also in Vienna for the TPNW meetings, Tom Unterreiner, who's the chairman of Britain's veteran Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and also runs Europeans for Nuclear Disarmament. That'll be next Saturday at noon Eastern. On Wednesday evening, we'll have a special session on the role Israel has played over the decades as a major nuclear proliferator and the near silence of members of the US political elite over that blatant hypocrisy and scofflawry. Oh, I love that word, scofflawry. Not even sure it's a word, but I just like it. I am really delighted that today, people in the NATO countries who have become newly concerned about the risks of nuclear conflict because of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, at least have a burgeoning global nuclear ban movement that can give us all hope that abolishing these weapons of terror once and for all is a real possibility. That was not the case during, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But it is true today, thanks to the efforts of the millions of people led by nations of the Global South that has built the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which came into force in 2017. As of now, 86 states have signed the TPNW and 62 have fully ratified it. Sadly, our country is not a signatory. I see our job as being to rebuild an anti-nuclear movement that's strong enough to push our government to sign on to this very important treaty, the TPNW, and to push for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. It is always sobering to remember that if nuclear annihilation happens, it will be a much speedier and more total form of annihilation than anything that climate change can cause. So we're lucky to have with us today someone who has worked tirelessly on these issues for many decades now, Joseph Gerson. Our project director here at Just World Ed, Amelle Zeroug, will be leading the conversation with Joseph today, while I dip behind the scenes and do the Zoom teching. If you need anything from me, I'll be in the chat box. I hope we'll have a good time for Q&A after Amelle has finished her conversation with Joseph. So now over to you, Amelle.
Thank you, Helena. It's really wonderful to have Joseph on today. I'd like to start with asking you, how long have you been involved in nuclear weapons abolition work?
It surprises me when I think about how long it's been. It's been a bit over 40 years. My first consciousness, as a kid, we all read Hiroshima by John Hersey, but that was abstract, it was distant, it was far away. And actually the wake up for me was in 1973 when I was here in Europe. We thought the was then called the October War was over. And I woke up one morning, people I was staying with were listening to Armed Forces radio to learn that Henry Kissinger had put US nuclear weapons on an alert. And that sort of, in some ways, opened the way for me to understand the relationship of nuclear weapons to what really is US empire and US foreign and military policies.
Can you speak to that a little bit more? How did you first, become involved, or what were the first steps that you took to?
So that was sort of a
abolition?
wake-up call. It took me a while to kind of process it, but I became aware that there was a pattern of, during international wars and crises, that the United States would, much as Putin has done now, threaten the possibility of a first strike nuclear attack. We've just now celebrated the 40th anniversary of the June 12th, 1982 demonstration. I was involved deeply with the movement at that time, supervising staff who were helping to organize it. But what most people don't think about now and didn't think about then was shortly before June 12th, I think it was on the 5th, the Israelis had invaded Lebanon. And I was deeply aware that behind the Israelis stood the US nuclear arsenal. And if the Syrians intervened, that meant that the Russians were behind, and we faced the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. And I did everything that I could to try to get the organizers to break their previous decision that there'd be no references to foreign military intervention in that demonstration. I was partially successful. But after that, I spent a lot of time with Daniel Ellsberg, who had been, he's best known for making the Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers available and helping to bring an end to the war. But most people don't know that Dan was a principal designer of US nuclear war policy for Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and to a limited degree, Nixon. And with him, I began to sort out, to learn more about this. And that led to early conferences that I organized, books that I wrote, and so on.
So you just touched on this, but can you talk a bit more about the role of nuclear weapons in upholding American hegemony? How have they changed American military strategy or diplomacy?
Sure. So actually, it's interesting. There's a lot of continuity. Former Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, in his valedictory testimony, and then more recently, the former head of Strategic Command, Charles Richards, I think is his name, both said that the primary purpose and function of U.S. nuclear weapons is not so much deterrence as it is to make our pursuit, our ability to fight conventional wars possible. By making the threats, it keeps, as Noam Chomsky would say, it ensures that no other nation will come to the assistance of countries that we're determined to attack. It's a model that we've used many times, and interestingly and appropriately, I mean, people are very upset by what Putin has done, but the way Putin has used it prevented the West from organizing no-fly zones and from putting in Western troops into Ukraine. And whether it's in relationship to Korea, whether it's with Vietnam, many times in the Middle East, this has been the pattern that the U.S. has pursued on more than 30 occasions. And we're just very lucky that we haven't had the accidents or the miscalculations that could have ended life as we know it.
Well, and on that, what are the nuclear dimensions and ramifications of the war in Ukraine?
So sort of two levels. I mean, we're not out of the greatest danger now. At the beginning of the war, senior figures on all sides were saying that they're parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that we should not pull too hard on the Gordian knot of war. So there's the possibility that, on the one hand, if Putin finds that his forces are caught in an endless war, much as both the Soviets and the U.S. were in Afghanistan, that bleeds their strength. And this, of course, is the stated goal now of the United States. It could, I mean, he's threatened. We don't know that it will happen, that they're also denying it, but he could launch a tactical nuclear weapon to terrorize Ukraine and force an end to the war on his terms. You know, a small nuclear weapon could be the size of Hiroshima or Nagasaki A-bombs. It's not like something small. And Kissinger has said that were the Russians to break that taboo, we would have to respond. So there's not been any war games that I'm aware of where there's been the use of tactical nuclear weapons that has not led to escalation. The other possibility, and again, you know, I'm amazed, constantly amazed with the kind of arrogance and, if you will, the ignorance of people in Washington. So as we have this rhetoric of winning the war, which is really an impossibility, or near impossibility, but were the Russian military to find itself somehow on the verge of defeat, again, the temptation for the Russians to use tactical nuclear weapons would be great. The Russian nuclear doctrine is that they would only use their nuclear weapons if their state is in jeopardy. Well, Putin is their state. So if you have the country being bled, or if you face a military defeat, Putin's rule would be jeopardized. And that then brings us into a situation where, up against the wall, he might take a really desperate action.
So why is it so critical that the US lead the movement for abolition?
Well, you know, the US is not going to lead the movement for abolition. You know, this is sort of like saying, you know, the old slave masters should lead the campaign for abolition of slavery. What's more important, I think, is, you know, the United States having been, you know, basically the driving force of nuclear arms races and continuing to hold the planet in jeopardy, needs to face the reality that even preparing, as even the Pope has said, preparing for nuclear weapons, for a nuclear war, it's insanity. You know, I've been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki many times. I've worked closely with A-bomb survivors, and Helena was making reference earlier today to the sessions here in Vienna at the ICAN conference, which began with the testimonies of A-bomb survivors, and they're not limited to Japan. I mean, A-bomb survivors are from Kazakhstan. A-bomb survivors are from the Midwest, from the Western United States. They're veterans of the U.S. military. But when you deeply engage in it, when you understand that even the use of a small tactical nuclear weapon is the imposition of total hell and threatens the annihilation of the human race, then it really becomes incumbent to do everything you can to work for their abolition. The United States is, you know, now on track to spend what, $1.7 trillion to replace its entire, upgrade its entire nuclear arsenal and all of the delivery systems. So when we don't have enough money to provide COVID vaccines for everybody, when we don't have adequate money to pay teachers and our schools are in serious jeopardy, you know, the money is there, and in part it's being spent in preparation for the end of human life. I mean, it's madness.
And so what are the political and technical steps that would need to be taken for the US to eliminate nuclear weapons?
Ooh, well, you know, politically, you know, I think you don't want to look to the leaders of the country, the people of power, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, to be providing leadership on this. It has to come from below. It has to come from a popular movement, from popular will. And we have experienced this in the nuclear field in terms of the freeze movement of the early 1980s, which essentially made major contributions to the end of the Cold War. It's, you know, the same with the women's rights movement, the same with the rights for freedom for people of color in our country. It has to come from below, and to make it impossible for politicians to do anything else. And then the next steps, I mean, we're in a situation now with the Ukraine war, and the policies of the last 20 years, where we're approaching what's been described as a new ice age. So beginning with the W. Bush administration, the United States moved to eliminate all the arms control agreements that we had with Russia, which provided strategic stability. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, you name it. So we're in a situation now where on top of that, you have just total lack of trust on all sides, where we need to begin recreating strategic stability. That's not nuclear disarmament, but to begin to create the communication, the trust building, which is difficult in the middle of a war, that could provide the foundation for disarmament negotiations. That has to be our first priority. And it applies not only to US and Russia, but US and China. And in the United States, there's been little awareness, little regard for the degree of military confrontations going on in the Asia Pacific. And while the Biden administration and the country as a whole appear to be so focused on Ukraine and reinforcing US power in Europe and to contain Russia, the real game for the longer term is competition for global dominance with China. The United States has the United States has the Pacific Ocean has been an American lake since 1975, and few people are aware of the construction, the basis of the U.S. empire began in 1898 with the conquest of the Philippines, Samoa, Guam, as a way to get the coaling stations needed to carve out our share of the China market. And we're now in a situation which is described as a Thucydides trap of the tensions between rising and declining powers. Many provocative military actions around Taiwan, the South China Sea, and deep, you look at Taiwan. Taiwan has become the hinge of the struggle for global power, and we're with commitments that have been made by the United States to Taiwanese independence and to defending it, and these have been reinforced and actually expanded by Biden. The situation is that were China to attempt to take over Taiwan, the Biden administration, the US, and Trump as well, are committed to defending Taiwan. Well, Taiwan cannot be defended by conventional military means. The only way that the US is able to maintain its dominance there is by the threat of nuclear attack. And it's because of the fear that removing the nuclear threat would serve as an invitation for the Chinese to take over Taiwan, that the Biden administration has reinforced the US first strike doctrine. I mean, most people think that our nuclear weapons are there principally for deterrence. Not so. They're there to maintain our dominance and power around the world.
Well, thank you. I want to come back to the work that you've been doing. So you were just in Mongolia. Could you tell us a little bit about the conference?
Sure. So I think the last place I ever expected to go was Mongolia. It's a long way from Boston. But over the years, I've done some work with conferences and side events in the United Nations during international conferences held there to try to uphold the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in that work, I had the privilege of meeting and working with the Mongolian ambassador to the UN, a man who also subsequently has been on the board of the International Peace Bureau with me. And Mongolia has the sole single nation nuclear weapons free zone, basically declaring no nuclear weapons on their territory, and so on. I got this invitation from him asking me to come to a conference there, which would honor their 30 years of having a nuclear weapons free zone, and with the goal of expanding that more regionally, especially to Northeast Asia. I think the biggest surprise for me, because I had not been a scholar of Mongolia, was to learn the roots of their nuclear weapons free zone in their commitment to independence, independence from China and independence from Russia. You listen and you learn. So you again, most people here are unaware that in the late 1960s, the Chinese and Russians almost went to war. There were clashes along their border. Tensions had been building for some time, and the Soviets deployed nuclear weapons into Mongolia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Mongolia was able to reassert its independence, one of the first things they did was to declare their nuclear weapons free zone as a way to reinforce their independence, both from Russia and from China. And this is something that they are pursuing with great intensity. I have to say, I was quite impressed by the commitments of members of the Mongolian elite. I mean, who thinks about the Mongolian elite, right? But here is the former president, former national security advisor, senior ambassadors, all of whom have helped to create and then to work through the United Nations and otherwise to make sure that their nuclear weapons free zone is protected. Now, this may seem very abstract to people. How does it relate to the wider world? Well, one of the things that they'll tell you, and this comes back here to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is that in the face of the nuclear weapon states, the big powers ignoring and continuing their arms races, non-nuclear weapon states have to do what they can to limit the dangers. And so with the creation of nuclear weapons free zones, which cover much of the face of the earth, they're in some ways surrounding and isolating the nuclear powers and providing a foundation for human survival into the future.
And so how do you see nuclear weapons free zones, as relating to the push for a nuclear weapons free world? Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. I think people are quite conscious here, as I was saying, and it relates absolutely to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Non-nuclear weapons states have felt marginalized, right? Many of them intimidated by the nuclear powers. And so what is it that they can do to exercise agency to limit the dangers and threats of the nuclear powers? And so, whether it's a nuclear weapons free zone for Africa, for Latin America, for Southeast Asia, it's a way of trying to mark off regions of the world where they will not permit the presence of nuclear weapons, and certainly not to be attacked by nuclear weapons. And the different zones are to different degrees respected by the nuclear powers, some more so than others. And it's a fight. They see it as a step, a necessary step toward eliminating nuclear weapons. I mean, the danger, one wants to be a force of hope, right? At the same time, we need to recognize that we're in a particularly dangerous moment now, not only out of Ukraine, but we're in a situation where we have major nuclear arms races. We're not reducing the number of nuclear weapons; they're being increased by the nuclear powers. And then with the Ukraine war, we have greater pressures for proliferation. So the concern, Ukraine inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal and gave it up with guarantees that they would not be attacked, that their sovereignty would be protected, and of course that was not respected. So in some countries, maybe Iran too, they're looking at this and saying, well, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, would they have been attacked? And this is this is leading to demands, certainly in Asia, where in South Korea, the new conservative government is asking the U.S. to bring its nuclear weapons back there. Similar pressures in Japan, and there are discussions in the right wing in both of these countries about the possibility of them becoming nuclear weapon states. So it's critically important now that we do everything we can to, if you will, build a bastion against proliferation and the acceleration of the arms race.
Thank you. Actually, coming back to that, the map that my colleague Helena just shared, why is it that the global South is leading the movement for nuclear weapons-free zones?
They don't want to be part of a nuclear war, and you know, it's you know, there's a kind of an arrogance of privilege and an arrogance of power in the North. An assumption, you know, that it's these white people of privilege who know what's best for the world and who disregard the needs and interests of other nations. And the reality is that many of these nations, even some that are authoritarian and have some corruption, are well aware that they need to take steps to protect humanity. You know, I certainly saw this in Mongolia, where you have, you know, the educated elite in a very traditional culture who have taken the steps that are needed. You've had brilliant leadership in terms of nuclear disarmament from over the years from Mexico. Egypt has been trying to lead the negotiation of a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone for years. And it has considerable international support behind it, but Israel is the obvious obstacle. So it's people looking after their interests, recognizing the danger, and taking informed steps.
And speaking of the conference that you just attended, do you have some quick snapshots to share of your experience?
From Mongolia?
Mm-hmm.
Snapshots. Yeah, I mean, as I said before, the thing that was most striking to me was an appreciation of the recognition of the need to maintain their independence from both China and Russia, something we don't think much about, and how their nuclear weapons-free zone plays into this. Also, a lot of discussion there about the possibility of creating a Northeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. We need to appreciate that you know, Korea has been divided now for what, almost 70 years. The war there never ended, and while we and the Japanese have been preoccupied by and the South Koreans, in many ways preoccupied by North Korea's development of a nuclear arsenal, you know, we don't really think about the fact that that arsenal was built in response to almost a dozen U.S. nuclear threats to eliminate North Korea and continuing military buildup. And you know, there were opportunities along the way. You know, back in 2000, there was a negotiation of a comprehensive agreement with North Korea that then Bush, when he came into power, just did away with. And you know, we're in a situation where the North Koreans, you know, oppressive as they may be, have been, you know, building their arsenal. So you have models and proposals coming out of Japan, coming out of South Korea and Mongolia for the creation of a nuclear weapons-free zone with considerable studies and political efforts in this regard. So that jumped out. The other thing, again, you know, for many of us, Genghis Khan is a mythical figure, right? A man who conquered much of the world. Striking to be in Mongolia to see how 1,000 years later he's seen as the father of the nation, as a source of inspiration, appreciated and respected for the administrative skills and innovations that he initiated, not only for Mongolia but for the world. That was pretty interesting too. What else to say? I guess the other pieces there, and kind of related actually to Genghis Khan, was just the degree of commitment of these people, not only Mongolians, but people from Japan, from China, from other countries. And I was also very, very privileged to have conversations with a senior Russian researcher talking about dynamics between the U.S., NATO on one hand and Russia on the other, and what might follow Putin. So I don't underestimate the privilege and the opportunities that come with participation in these kind of conferences, and try to do what I can to build from them.
What other nations do you see as leading the struggle for nuclear abolition?
For nuclear abolition, well, actually, Austria has played a very strong role in this. One time after the movement, well, you go back. I mean, the Norwegians and others in the difficult meetings in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences. I mean, basically, what happens? You have this. Really, one of the seminal treaties of the 20th century was the NPT. And it's built on three legs, grand bargain. On the one hand, the nuclear powers in Article 6 committed to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of the nuclear weapons. And in exchange, the non-nuclear weapons states forswore ever becoming nuclear powers and were given the inalienable right to generate nuclear power for peaceful purposes, a serious flaw. And what you have is that the nuclear powers have consistently refused to implement their obligations, right? So it's out of that refusal that the pressures leading to the negotiation of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons emerged. And it began with Norway and several other countries saying we need to change the frame of reference. Instead of looking at nuclear weapons as the guarantee of national security, and a national security paradigm, we need to come back to the basics, right? What are the human consequences of nuclear weapons? What have they already wrought on humanity, including the illnesses, the deaths, the dangers coming from the nuclear fuel cycle? Workers who've created these, people within, I mean, many people in the Western United States have died as a result of U.S. nuclear weapons testing. I was at one of the meetings. Yeah, I think it was actually here in Vienna. There were a series of 3 conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and in the last one here, in addition to Japanese and Australian nuclear weapons victims, there was a woman from St. George, Utah, who was wheeled onto the stage. And unlike other people who were reading speeches, she gave an extemporaneous, from the heart speech, which began by saying, "My government has killed me," explaining how she was dying of cancer, how many other people in St. George area also dying as a function of the fallout from the testing. And it's this transition. And then there's a really quite remarkable diplomat here, Alexander Kemet, Austrian diplomat. I was with him, I lose track of the years. It must have been, maybe it was 2017, 2016 perhaps, in Nagasaki. I was sharing a panel with him. And he'd been at the World Conference Against A&H Bombs, which is sort of the anniversary and a seminal event. And it was clear how much he had taken in the testimonies, the pain, the history, commitments of the A-bomb victims in Japan. And then it led him to organize the conference that I just described here, leading to the negotiation of the TPNW. Other countries, I was from another person who was on maybe that panel or another one. I was very impressed by actually ambassador from Ireland, who really saw great opportunities in the possibility of this negotiation. One other person who actually the International Peace Bureau is going to be honoring in this August is Ambassador White Gomez from Costa Rica. She was the diplomat who oversaw the negotiation of the TPNW at the United Nations several years ago. So, you know, the number of people, Brazilians have played a major role. A man named Sergio Duarte, who was the High Representative for nuclear weapons at the UN. And to appreciate, even as I name, you know, these kind of high, you know, officially high-ranking figures, what they've done is only possible because of social movements from below. And you know, that's what we have to look at regenerating. My hope is that with quite a number of people in the United States and certainly other countries having been shocked by Putin's nuclear threats, that this will help to remind us of the immediacy, potential immediacy of the danger. I mean, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, created by some of the people who invented the A-bomb way back when in the 40s, they have what's called their doomsday clock. And every year they do analysis in terms of how close humanity is to apocalypse, principally from nuclear weapons. And they set their doomsday clock in quite a public ceremony to try to send out the warning to humanity. For the last couple of years, that clock has been set at 100 seconds to midnight. It has never been closer than that, trying to help us understand the immediacy of the danger.
Thank you. I want to come back to the ICAN gatherings in Vienna. I was wondering if you've had any kind of interesting experiences so far.
Well, it just began this morning, and in truth to tell, my train was late last night. I got in at 2 o'clock in the morning, so I've engaged to a degree. And you know, basically, I think there are two major functions for this conference. I'm not speaking for the organizers, but it'd be my observation. On the one hand, it's to generate as much popular support pressure from below for the meeting of governments that'll take place here beginning on Monday, to make the most of this opportunity, to press for the deepening commitments of the countries that have ratified the treaty, and to press them to reach out to engage other countries. I mean, one of the provisions of the TPNW is that those who have ratified it will take actions to try to bring other states and other nuclear weapon states in. The other thing which is interesting to me, you know, in addition to the big plenary, there's a number of workshops on a range of issues, and I think most of the people here are relatively young, and that's a delight to me. And I think what those sessions are doing is helping to educate and motivate a new generation of nuclear weapons abolitionists, and so that's a very encouraging part of what's happening here.
It seems to me that you know, globally this is a young person's struggle, but in the U.S. not so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, what do you think we can do to inform and energize a new generation of anti-nuclear activists in the U.S.?
So I think there are a number of different things that can be done. You know, it's important to have programs and activities that engage young people and in which young people can exercise leadership. You know, my vocabulary, my experiences, my being a Luddite is not necessarily something that inspires young people. So we have to, I think, really make the space, do the education, make the commitments. And it has to be done in partnership with young people. And there are, I mean, one of the people who is playing a leading role in ICAN is my former intern, very bright, wonderful young woman. For those in the audience now who may have access to resources, the number of organizations working for nuclear disarmament in the United States are limited, and are limited in their resources. In the early 80s, when we had the nuclear weapons freeze movement, we had that kind of momentum. We had serious money from foundations that made it possible for us to hire educators and organizers across the country. Made it possible for us to hire interns and give young people the space and the opportunity to do movement building. One of the other things that we had then, that I've been struggling for a long time, we had a wonderful frame of reference, which was the call to halt the nuclear arms race. It was called the freeze. It was not a commitment to abolition, but it was a commitment to end the arms race. And at that point, it was extremely dangerous state of the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And with that slogan, if you will, that seemed eminently fair to people at a time when people understood the danger in a way that they don't now, we had a vehicle to engage the wider public. So, some of the history has not been written. So, I was in meetings where, after Randy had come up with the concept, we were talking, how do we take it out to more people? We recognize it's not abolition, but the freeze is a necessary step in the direction of abolition. And one of my colleagues, an unsung hero named David McCauley, who was a young organizer in Vermont, having learned from something that had taken place in Western Massachusetts, said, I'm going to take the idea of a nuclear freeze to town meeting, kind of the mythic origin of American democracy. And he said, this season, 15 towns will vote for the freeze, and next year, 175. And we thought to ourselves, Dave, that's not going to happen, but go for it. And that season, 17 towns voted for it. There was an op-ed in the New York Times in response out of that. In '82, before the big demonstration in New York, 330 towns and cities across the Northeast voted for the freeze. 8 states in referendums voted for the freeze. And it was that kind of force from below that led Ted Kennedy in the Senate and Ed Markey in the House, if you will, to try to capture leadership of the movement and push it forward. And there were similar kinds of activities taking place across Europe. Unlike now with Putin, we had an enlightened Soviet head of state, Gorbachev, who understood that if there was any chance to save the Soviet economy, he had to stop spending money on nuclear weapons. And there was this bringing together of forces, including the Swedes with the common security work that they did, that led to the negotiation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement in 1987. Most people don't understand the Cold War ended in 1987 with the negotiation of that treaty. It came before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It came before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it came out of popular movements. And going back to your question, I think the challenge has been, how do we come up with a phrasing, with a paradigm that is similar to what Randy Forsberg came up with. And part of it may lie in creating a fusion between nuclear disarmament and climate movements, climate sustainability. I mean, we're facing, and your generation knows it better than mine and faces it more immediately, the consequences of climate change. I mean, just look with the fires that we've got now, the floods and everything else. It's going to cost trillions of dollars to protect our cities. We're a coastal, the United States is a coastal society. Miami's already frequently underwater. how do you protect them? It's going to take a lot of investment, a lot of innovation. Where's the money for that? It lies in what $1.7 trillion that we're spending for new nuclear weapons. And add to that, of course, we face, as Noam Chomsky reminds us all the time, humanity faces two existential threats: nuclear war and climate change. And we need to find ways to integrate them.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that topic, I mean, in your work, when have you seen successful coalition building?
That's been a challenge. There've been efforts not only in relationship to climate, but also in relationship to social and economic justice. The National Priorities Project has provided us an important model in that way. One of my concerns, which grows out of maybe to a degree some of the individualism of U.S. culture, is the idea of, I have my issue, I have my thing I'm working on, and kind of siloed analysis and siloed movements. The reality is that if we're going to make the change that we need, we have to integrate both our analysis and our movements. That's the work for all of us.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to open up to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But while we're waiting, I'd love it if you could give us some other notable experiences from your early involvement in the movement.
Well, I'll give you two. Maybe focus on one. So in 1983, so this is ancient history. In 1983, a colleague of mine in San Francisco who worked for Israeli-Palestinian peace and opposed to U.S. interventions in the Middle East, called me and said, Joe, there's an effort now to turn Boston Harbor into a nuclear weapons base so the U.S. can send its warships with nuclear weapons to the Middle East. I thought, okay, well, thanks for that. And so I began researching it, digging into it. And what I found was that the Reagan administration was seeking to bring out old battleships that had been mothballed in Philadelphia, other places, and to put nuclear-armed cruise missiles on those ships and on destroyers that would accompany them. The Reagan people, somebody there had to have a sense of humor. And they thought, it's certainly cynical, let's set up a competition in the Northeast between Boston, Rhode Island, and New York to get this base and the dollars that will come with it. And so I dug in on that with some of my colleagues. We researched what the function of this would be, which was actually to take the nuclear threat much closer to the Soviet Union at the height here of the Cold War. And Senator Kennedy and actually the whole Massachusetts congressional delegation had all been supporters of the nuclear weapons freeze. Well, this was a violation of the freeze. It was a new nuclear weapon, and they thought, well, there'll be money here. Bring home the bacon. So I was also aware at that time of the history of naval nuclear weapons accidents. We also looked at, with the help of city planners and others, the fact that very few permanent jobs would come, that there were better ways to develop the Boston economy than in this particular area than to make it into a naval base. But also the reality that this base was going to be directly across the bay from Logan Airport, one of the runways. So you face the danger of that kind of accident. So we did a lot of education, support about it, building opposition to it. At one point, we brought the former operations officer of the Third Fleet to testify before the Boston City Council. It was supposed to be a slam dunk, and to give the endorsement of it. He testified about nuclear weapons accidents that he had witnessed and their dangers. It's also interesting, you think of the Boston Globe as a liberal newspaper. I had actually brought Palestinian and Israeli advocates for opposition to the occupation and working for just peace. I brought them to meet with some of the editorial writers at the Globe. In the last 5 minutes, these editorial writers who knew what I was doing on the possibility of this base turned it around on me and tried to dictate what the terms and conditions for the public debate would be. And the next day, instead of an editorial about the rights of Palestinians, there was an editorial about limiting the debate for these bases. So it's interesting, as I worked on it, at one point I called a reporter for the Globe asking, when are you going to give some coverage to our opposition? I said, well, didn't you hear? I mean, the owner of the paper has said there's to be no coverage of this until you make it impossible for us not to cover it. So we continued organizing. We had demonstrations and so on. And then one Saturday morning, I woke up and a guy named Dudley Clenahan, I believe his name was, had written a half page in the New York Times about the dangers, the threats in our opposition. That blew it wide open. We pressed and we won. Senator Kennedy had been, because Kennedy wanted it, the entire congressional delegation was lined up behind him. It's pretty rare that you beat Senator Kennedy in Massachusetts on something. And that in turn, I had a friend who'd been working with the Japanese peace movement. I had been unaware that the weapon system, the Sea Launched Cruise Missile in the Atlantic, was actually Reagan's principal escalation of nuclear threats in Asia Pacific. And that led me, he shared it, what we were doing with people in Japan, and that led me to 1984, my first trip to Japan and deep work with the Japanese peace movement. So it's a long story, but certainly a defining one for me.
Yes, thank you. I'd love it if you could speak a little bit about that first trip. Oh, actually, Helen is here.
Hi. Yeah, I actually have a couple of questions, Joseph. I know we don't have much more time, but you had talked about the success of the movement in the 1980s having stemmed from having a clear goal of nuclear freeze that people could get behind at the time. So what do we need to do to have nuclear ban be something that people of, Amelle's generation can get behind? And maybe this is also a question for Amelle. It seems like a pretty straightforward goal, but is it because people haven't thought about nuclear risks recently? Is it because a lot of people in the United States and maybe other NATO countries are kind of complacent that this nuclear thing gives us protections in a scary time? Or is it because all the stuff that people have done is to, the anti-nuclear movement is kind of old and nothing much has happened in the last 20 years? What can we do? I mean, it's a question for both of you, and sorry to spring this on you, Amelle, but whatever you can add.
So I'll jump for a second and to say that one of the things that I've been saying is that the real cutting edge for the nuclear ban movement, I don't think is actually in the United States. I think it's in the nuclear umbrella states. It's the countries in NATO, Japan, Korea, countries that are ostensibly defended by nuclear weapons and by the discipline of NATO. And if one of those countries breaks, if they say, we're rejecting this because we know it's a threat, that begins to unravel the fabric that holds the nuclear threats, the nuclear arms race in place. In the United States, I think, we're facing, as everybody knows, an economic crisis. I guess the two things I would focus on, and Helen Caldicott did a great job on this in the 1980s, we need to help people understand just quite how dangerous the moment is. I mean, when you look at Ukraine, there is the danger of an escalating nuclear war, right? And is great, and maybe even greater than that, is Taiwan. We need to help people understand quite how dangerous it is. And with that, I think we begin to get some leverage in terms of saying, no, you've got to halt the arms race, you've got to cut the spending, and we have real human social needs in our country, right? We have need for investment in all kinds of things. The money is there. I mean, Amelle's future and the future of her generation lies in the kind of resources and priorities the country has. So I think it may lie somewhere in there, but you know, no one has the particular answer, and we have to work together to try to find, you know, what that particular focus is going to be.
Amelle, do you have anything you can put in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that I think it's, to answer your question, I think it's something that people from my generation are generally uninformed about, or it's seen as not necessarily distinct from the military industrial complex generally. And I don't know that there's the same sense of urgency that I think young people globally have about nuclear issues. And I really agree with what Joseph said earlier. I think the solution to this is really coalition building, and bringing people who are already working on issues of climate justice and you know, and peace generally, to be thinking about nuclear issues.
I mean, one of the other things I think we can do, and we've done a little bit of this, is, you know, to bring U.S. nuclear weapons victims, to give them public forums, right? You know, Native Americans have been, especially been devastated by this. But to say, you know, it's sort of shocking for many U.S. people to see a blue-eyed blonde from Utah talk about how her father and father-in-law died from uranium mining, how her sister and daughter died from fallout, and how she's struggling for her life. And I think, you know, at some levels, making it real, right? You know, the Japanese A-bomb survivors are, you know, they're dying, but there's still some alive and still giving testimony. One of the things that's sort of, you know, it's a function of being old, but sort of wake up for me. Sometimes when I give talks, my hosts say, look, you've got to remember to explain what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because young people don't know. I mean, how can you not know that? It's certainly not taught in our schools. And so, you know, teaching, yeah, I remember Howard Zinn. We did a film where we interviewed him, and you know, he said, look, if you don't know your history, you can't be free. Every time the president comes on television and says we're in danger from here or there, not knowing your history, you have no basis to make judgments. So we've got to teach, you know, the real history, and link that with the kind of dangers and threats that we all face.
Yeah, I just actually seen the time here, and I will be needing to go pretty soon, but I also want to jump in and say what Joseph says about like having the stories well told and the history well documented and well presented is really important. And I mean, one of the things I will always be grateful to Joseph for is that he had, when my husband and our daughter and I were going to Japan in, I want to say 2000 or 2004, he had introduced us to a really lovely woman called Watanabe Junko, who was an A-bomb survivor, Hibakusha, and she graciously showed us around Hiroshima. And, you know, reliving that past, I mean, I guess she was then in her 70s. She's probably now almost pushing 90. I think she's at the Vienna conference. But reliving those traumas, it's difficult for people, you know. I mean, you have to sort of perform your trauma over and over again until people in the United States will wake up and understand, like, this is really outrageous that our government did this. So yeah, I mean, the more we can figure out ways to get this stuff conveyed. And yes, Joseph, you're quite right. There are a whole generation of people who not a little bit, unclear about what happened in Hiroshima, who don't know all the jargon. And I actually, like you were referring to the NPT, and I was spelling it out in the chat, because we have to educate, do a lot of educating. And it's been great to have this session, because this will be part of our ongoing project. And I'm very grateful to you giving us the time to do this, because I know you're in Vienna and you're going to be meeting all kinds of exciting people, and I hope we can have a good debrief when you get back. I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes here. First, I want people to remember that Just World Educational is completely reliant on grassroots support to keep our programming going. So if you haven't donated to us recently, please go to the donate button on our website, www.justworldeducational.org. Second, on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, we'll be having our discussion on Israel's role as a nuclear proliferator. We had been hoping for a special guest from that region, but it looks as though that will not work out. So this may end up as being just a discussion between Amelle and me, building on the work I've done on the issue dating back to the late 1980s. Anyway, let's go ahead and hold that session at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thirdly, I want everybody to remember that all the records of the conversations in this series are being made available in as timely a fashion as possible. We hope you can share them with your friends and networks. I'm traveling. This is my little, okay, this is where you go. We're also starting to build all these records into a new online learning hub on our website, and we're also going to work to make this into a more coherent kind of nuclear abolition 101 course that anybody can just download snippets from here and there, and it'll all be organized and ready. Well, we hope it'll be helpful. It will need funding, however. If anybody could dig into their pocket and make another donation for us, that would be great. So now I have to say goodbye, and big thanks to you, Joseph Gerson, for being with us in the middle of your very important travels. I know that from Vienna, you will be going on to the, Dismantle NATO conference that'll be in Madrid. So, the Mickey Mat more generally, which delighted that you're there, and we'll hope to hear back from you.
So let me just take a second as we leave, going back to history for a moment. I have always had the greatest respect for you, Helena, as one of the most courageous correspondents during the Lebanese Civil War, and just to appreciate how that commitment and the energy that you had then as a correspondent has seen you through to this work, and then also just to appreciate meeting Amelle. And to appreciate your commitments, and looking forward to working with both of you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Amelle.
Thank you,
Joseph. Goodbye, everybody, and see you again Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern.